Last month, Team Reptile released Bomb Rush Cyberfunk, a skating and graffiti game that's a clear spiritual successor to Jet Set Radio. The team was also responsible for the awesome dodgeball-esque fighting game Lethal League, a game wrapped in that Jet Set Radio style. I enjoyed BRC when I played it myself, but I knew that if I was going to appreciate it properly, I had to play the game that inspired it all. As someone who grew up in the post-Dreamcast era, Jet Set Radio was never fully on my radar. I'd heard mentions of it here and there, but what I saw of it didn't pique my interest. I thought the graphics looked cool, but just wasn't into inline skating at the time. Now, of course, I've heard so much praise for this game that I knew I needed to tackle it at some point. You've likely heard all that praise yourself, or otherwise you've been one of those proclaiming your love for this series, which has all but been forgotten by Sega. So, 23 years later, I strapped on my skates, grabbed my paint cans, and stopped this silly metaphor as I played Jet Set Radio. I should mention that I played this via the Steam port, which, to my understanding, is the same game in 16:9 widescreen and with maybe a few tweaks here and there. One thing I did notice is that this little camera movement when hitting a graffiti spot never played in the Steam port. I never would have noticed that if I hadn't needed to look up how to hit a specific spot, and I'm not sure if this is a bug or just an odd change that they made. I'm sure a JSR expert out there can tell you exactly what changed from version to version, but I'm not that. The first thing I did, as you'd expect, is hit up the tutorial, and I'm really glad I did. Not just because it taught me the basic mechanics, but also because it helped me set my expectations accordingly. See, when it comes to skating games, I'm used to the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater approach, where the skating is more arcade-like, which suits a points-driven system well. Jet Set Radio is a different beast, more like an action-adventure game, where the skates are how you get from point A to point B. You're not hitting lines or building up your combo, for instance. It's a refreshingly pure experience in that regard, maybe not completely realistic, but down to earth for sure. That made it hard for me to get into the game at first, even with my adjusted outlook. I wouldn't say Jet Set Radio was unintuitive, but I had to discard a lot of natural instincts and refresh my brain a bit. You play as the GGs, one of many street gangs hitting the streets of Tokyo-to, recruiting members and avoiding the corporations and the police who want to crush you. Your first task is to impress Gum and Tap, which is pretty easy, but it's also where I began to grapple with the controls. This is a game from 2000 after all, so I expected them to be looser, and looser they were. Specific things like connecting to grind rails and figuring out your jump angle was a problem at first. You can chalk this up to me still getting my skating legs, so to speak, and thankfully, once the game actually starts, it kicks up the jams. And not just because of DJ Professor K and his sick tunes. After getting your crew off the ground, you head off to find out which game's attacking your home turf, selecting your favorite skater, and heading off into the mission area. This is where the graffiti gameplay rears its head, as your main goal is hitting every marked area with your own art. All well and good, except for the police, who get increasingly aggressive the more spots you hit. Most officers weren't a problem for me, as they can only melee attack, with maybe only Captain Onishima posing a threat, although he's pretty easily avoided. I also initially struggled with finding all the graffiti locations. I didn't learn until later that there's a map in the menu, which is helpful for figuring out where to go next, but lacks a lot of useful information, like height and nearby obstacles. The biggest problem for me was navigating these areas to begin with. I didn't gel with the map design because it either felt too constrictive or too open, missing that sweet spot in between. Some levels were better than others. I disliked this playground and half-pipe level, and the construction yard was alright, but doesn't have enough stuff to grind on. If this game was more conducive towards combos and building up speed, this wouldn't be an issue, but then the maps aren't really built for that either. The consequence is that, unfortunately, the skating in Jet Set Radio feels lackluster. Rather than a standout element, it was a hindrance, a ball and chain that kept me from getting into the gameplay. Take half-pipe skating, for instance. I usually love vert skating in video games, but there's so little you can do with it here, not to mention how stiff it feels. It might also be the lack of variety in the mission structure that made me unable to connect with the game initially. Let's look at your first couple of objectives. Tag all the graffiti spots, tag all the graffiti spots, tag all the graffiti spots, recruit a rival skater, tag all the graffiti spots, and take down a rival gang. You're moving between different areas, so it's not visually boring, but it's repetitive at its core. Graffiti tagging isn't too bad. Once you learn the level and the spots, it's mostly a matter of getting your angles and jumps right. But the skater challenges are pretty underwhelming. You're just copying the same moves as them, which rarely amounts to anything complicated. As for the gang takedowns, these are kind of fun, but they're made annoying thanks to one frustrating control issue. Spraying paint is on the same button as resetting your camera, which is normally fine when you're tagging spots, but when you're repeatedly attacking an enemy on the move, that's where it gets distracting. It can even completely mess with your view. Jet Set Radio's controls haven't aged tremendously. The physics aren't very tight, and controlling your character takes a while to get used to. The camera occasionally gave me a very poor view of what I was aiming for as well. But while these are hurdles, once you get the hang of them, the game starts to pick up speed. It was in the second half of the first chapter, after defeating Poison Jam and heading to Bentencho, that I started to see why this game is a classic. This part of Tokyo-to is much more fun to skate around in, thanks to there being plenty more obstacles and grind spots, not to mention a better atmosphere with the nighttime setting. Seriously, this part of town looks super cool. And yeah, you can't talk about this game without mentioning the aesthetics. Jet Set Radio was evidently the first game to use a full cel-shaded style, and even with the Dreamcast-era models, the game still looks nice. There's something about cel shading that makes games like this look more timeless. It's not overly simple, and it stood out among contemporary games, both realistic and cartoony. It's only the model fidelity that's dated here, the actual design still holds up. That includes the graffiti designs inspired by and created by actual graffiti artists. That's a pretty important part of Jet Set Radio's identity, and I can't think of many other games that used it in this way. Considering the anti-authoritarian and rebellious themes, it's a perfect fit, and it's nice to see the positive sides of graffiti highlighted here. I mean, I lived in a smallish town for most of my life where I'd see the occasional tag here and there, but now that I live in an actual city, it's more apparent to me as a part of human culture, so this game's depiction hits harder to me now. I mean, that graffiti is a crime warning at the beginning is antithetical to the whole point, but that's likely there for legal reasons, so I won't complain. Hard to harp on it for long anyway, when you're grooving out to these tunes. This is what I was most familiar with beforehand, because Hideki Naganuma's music is legendary. His tracks fuse many different genres together, hitting a lot of moods all at once to create something very special. It's also nice to play a skating game with mostly original music, rather than just licensed stuff. Not that there isn't licensed music here, but it's balanced with the original soundtrack, which I appreciate. There's a lot of videos that go into why this music is so good, so I won't repeat those points here. I'll just reiterate what everyone else says and say that it's incredible stuff. It also helps that the game's pretty tongue-in-cheek, it knows it's ridiculous and runs with it. Early on, our faithful dog Potts gets kidnapped, and all Beat can do is shrug his head with that silly little smirk on his face. Occasionally, there'd be some pretty wacky stuff that happened in my playthrough as well, like Gum wiping out hard right here and then getting up and dancing like it was nothing. Character is something that Jet Set Radio does really well, as it manages to make all these weirdos you recruit incredibly charming. Beat gets the most love as the face of the series, but I also really liked Sugar and Garam's designs and got a kick out of Mew's unbridled enthusiasm.
Yeah!
Others like Yo-Yo and Slate skeeved me out. I do not like them, and I do not like their style. Speaking of Yo-Yo, he introduces another mission type, racing to a graffiti spot and being the first to tag it. Pretty simple, just beat your opponent to the punch and try not to screw it up. Which, if you really don't know these levels, can happen often. Like with Yo-Yo's race, he does take quite a few unnecessary detours, so if you know where you need to end up, you can blaze past him. But it's once you get to the alleyways that this section gets pretty unfair. The map only tells you where the tag spot is and not how to get there or what the best route is. I reset quite a few times here, and it was always due to that final section. Funnily enough, once I switched off Garam and chose Tab instead, I nailed this one, so clearly, this is Garam's fault. But considering Yo-Yo's voice is pretty grating, it was a bittersweet victory to say the least. It's at this point where the plot starts to kick into high gear, as the Golden Rhino's assassins and the Rokaku Corporation threaten to stop the GGs for good. We're introduced to Combo and Cube, starting the second chapter that depicts their struggles on the streets of Grind City, sort of analogous to the US. This chapter is not a favorite of the developers, it wasn't even present in the initial Japanese version, and they were basically forced to add it at the behest of Sega. It focuses on Combo and Cube's story and their missing friend Coin, kidnapped by the Golden Rhinos because he had a piece of the Devil's Contract, a vinyl record that can evidently summon a demon to the person that holds it. I wasn't expecting this game to get supernatural, but hey, I can dig it. What I can't dig are the missions here, because geez, the game starts to get exasperating here. The objectives are the same, but now the maps are interconnected, meaning you have a much larger space to play around in. That'd be cool if this game focused on the skating, but here it doesn't flow as well. The challenge ramps up nicely enough, but if you couldn't get used to the controls before this point, this becomes more or less a giant roadblock. The combo and cube recruitment missions are bad enough, this half-pipe section especially frustrated me, but nothing prepared me for the grind city levels. And I'm not just saying that because after listening to a bunch of Japanese big beat and indie rock, I was suddenly graced with a Rob Zombie remix. This chapter brings in a soundtrack that's licensed from contemporary US acts like the aforementioned Rob Zombie, Cold, and Jurassic 5. It's not that these tracks are bad, a lot of them are actually pretty sweet, and I kinda like that Dracula remix. But here's the thing, Naganuma's soundtrack gave this game its own style and set it apart from other similar titles. With this soundtrack, it's just any other skating game. It'd be more of a sticking point if the music was unfitting, but that's thankfully not the case. No, what's annoying about this section is how the loose controls makes hitting the spots a complete gamble. Especially these wall riding sections, which basically require a perfect jump and position, and the camera readjusting as you try to tag doesn't help. There's also getting onto the train tracks, which has no real rhythm to it. There are plenty of ways you could theoretically get up there, but the game gimps you unless you do it properly. Freedom and exploration is not one of JSR's strong suits, and this first Grind City level especially makes that evident. The interesting thing about this level is that it's built more for skating, and if that were the focus, this area would be far more enjoyable. Like, I could imagine this working well for a Tony Hawk style challenge, but for this, it's far less organic. Not a great first impression for Grind City, and this level alone took me way longer than I'd like to admit to beat. Maybe combo wasn't suited for this level, but still, ugh. Your enemies get far more vicious in this section too, with some sporting long whips that reduce the distance they need to be at to strike you. Although, make no mistake, they can be pretty stupid sometimes. This second section is thankfully much better, it's better designed, and the challenge is more appropriate. It's by far the most dangerous level because of how much height you get, but there's plenty of lines to hit, a great sense of scale, and also less urgency due to a higher time limit. Also, I love how this level includes a giant American flag so you know you're skating around somewhere that's not Japan. The enemies in this stage use electrical attacks, which feels like a pretty natural hazard for a level set in a Times Square-like location. Could have done without the helicopters though. Now that they've got missiles, you're basically forced to deal with them. Your biggest obstacle though is missing the grind rails and falling. This happened to me quite a bit. I wouldn't call this level better than the Tokyo-To stages, but at the very least, it's a fun and engaging challenge. And it looks like Cube went to the same finishing school as Gum did. Yeah. Anyway, Chapter 2's story ends with no further information gained. We already knew about the Golden Rhinos, and they were clearly our next target, so we could have gathered that they were evil. Again, a consequence of jamming this into the middle of the adventure. Chapter 3 doesn't introduce anything new. You're still tagging designated areas and recruiting new skaters. It also ramps up the toughness. Getting through the full map of Kogane was a slog, for instance, but the game wasn't throwing anything new and unexpected my way. Except that I was getting piss-poor ratings? I refuse to accept that. You're a pedal, game. Although, given my inability to hit simple grind spots, maybe I deserve it after all. But uh-oh, while we were busy spraying up the streets, somebody stole the devil's contract. I blame Yo-Yo for this. Yo-Yo! That leads to the final boss battle against the leader of the Golden Rhinos, Goji Rokaku. I can't say I was expecting a full-on boss fight, but I suppose they implemented it kinda well. You'd think the final objective would be testing your dexterity on an obstacle course, but this fight's mostly about hitting graffiti before time is up. Not bad, just kind of a lame ending. I gotta say though, getting the final hit on Goji is incredibly irksome. All the centrifugal force meant that I couldn't get up these grind rails, and I only managed to make it by what felt like dumb luck. While I don't like how Jet Set Radio ends, I was pretty satisfied with my time in this game. It's aged quite a bit, especially with its physics and gameplay, but in many ways, it's surprisingly fresh. I can see why it's a beloved franchise. I came in too late to get suckered into it, but for what it's worth, I had a good time here. This video was planned to be a look at the whole Jet Set Radio series, as the only other games I'd have to look at are the Game Boy Advance version and the Xbox follow-up Jet Set Radio Future. Unfortunately, that ended up not happening for two reasons. First, my Xbox 360 finally bit the dust, meaning I have no consoles that can play Future right now. And second, I just kinda ran out of time to even do the GBA port. Perhaps later then. Still, I am glad that I finally gave this game a shot. Maybe I don't fully understand the concept of the love for this game, but it gave me a few solid hours of enjoyment, which is all you can hope for. And hey, it made me enjoy Bomb Rush Cyberfunk even more, so it did its job for me.